Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thank you so much for joining me today for another art video. In the past few months, I've had lots of people reach out asking me for tutorials using watercolor pencils. And so this week I prepared a step-by-step, beginner-friendly, very simple tutorial for you guys using this medium. I kept things as simple as possible while still developing a bit of realism in the piece via creating a variety of different values and textures. I only used 5 different colors and there is no intricate color mixing involved or anything of the sort. Right now on screen, you're watching me create that preliminary pencil sketch completely freehand, very lightly using an HB pencil because number one, I want to be able to erase mistakes very easily. And number two, I don't want my pencil lines to show through my color at the end. That's just a personal preference, but I always make sure to draw in that outline sketch very lightly. By drawing lightly, you're also ensuring that you're not scratching or damaging your paper in any way. For this little illustration, I am using a piece of Arches hot press 140-pound watercolor paper, but you can use any kind of paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums, whether it be a sheet like I am using right now, or something like a sketchbook or anything like that. This said, for the techniques that I'm going to be explaining today, I wouldn't really use thinner paper because we're going to be doing layering, we're going to be doing gentle scrubbing, and especially when we're just getting started with water-soluble mediums and we haven't completely mastered water control, it can be very easy to start making holes in our paper. Another thing that's super important to take into account is that the amount of texture or tooth on your paper is going to have a huge impact and effect on both your process as well as your finished piece. Most likely than not, if your paper has a lot of texture to it, then that watercolor pencil is going to have to fight against that tooth a bit and you're going to end up with higher amounts of texture at the end. In the description box below, I'm going to make sure to leave you links to not only the specific supplies that I am using today, but other options in terms of both sketchbooks for water-soluble mediums or mixed media that I have used in the past, as well as watercolor paper pads with separate sheets that would work great for the techniques that I'm going to be showing you today. And I'm going to make sure to include both accessibly priced options as well as more highly priced options for those of you who have the budget. I want to make it super clear that this is my personal way of using watercolor pencils because there are so many ways of using this particular medium. There are always different ways of using any medium, but in this case, when it comes to watercolor pencils are both a drawing and a painting medium combined. And there are so many ways of using them and bringing your own style into the picture. I've been asked before if you have to bring in water and paintbrushes when you're using watercolor pencils, and of course not. You don't have to. You can use them however you want. However, if I don't want to bring in water into the picture, I just stick to using my regular Prismacolor pencils that are not water soluble. When I'm using my watercolor pencils, I do like just taking advantage of the fact that they're water soluble and combine both watercolor effects as well as colored pencil effects into one same piece. In the past, I've shared some resources, both blog posts and YouTube videos on watercolor pencils in which I explain the similarities and differences between regular watercolor paint and watercolor pencils and just go much more into depth in terms of the particularities of this medium and some tips. So that's going to be left down below for you in the description box as well in case you'd like to go and check it out before or after this video. Alright, so if you've been a YouTube subscriber for a while, then you're probably already well aware that I'm a huge fan of selecting the specific colors that we're going to be using for the piece on hand before actually getting started, just to make sure that the color scheme in itself looks nice. And if I were going to be mixing any colors together, I would also be testing those color mixtures out so that I don't have any accidents or surprises as I'm actually going through the painting process. As I was mentioning before, today I'm going to be using a total of 5 colors, and right here I am swatching out the main ones that I am going to be using for the macarons. For the one on the top, I'm going to be using my golden brown from my Derwent watercolor pencil set. And this could be a vanilla or perhaps an even coconut flavored macaron. For the one in the middle, I'm going to be using my crimson lake color. This one could be a strawberry, raspberry, or rose flavored macaron. And the last one in the bottom is going to be colored in with Prussian blue. And in terms of blue macarons that I've seen in the past, I've seen flavors like salted caramel, mint, toasted marshmallow, and I've also seen vanilla flavored blue macarons. And finally, I also swatched out the copper beach color from my Derwent watercolor pencil set. This is the darkest brown that is available in this set that I have. And I'm going to be using this to darken values in certain areas in all three macarons. And the fifth and last color that I didn't really take time to swatch out is my ivory black, and that color is only going to be used to create the bit of illusion of cast shadow below the macarons. Now, I am sharing these colors with you just so that you know what I am using today, but don't feel obligated to use these exact same colors. Use what you have on hand. Any light brown or golden color that you have, maybe a yellow ochre, something like that, is going to work great for the one on the top. Any pinkish, kind of cool red color is going to work great for the one in the middle. And any dark blue is going to work well for the one in the bottom. Alright, so as you can see, I'm getting started with my first layer of color. I am using very light scribbling motions and making sure to leave areas of my paper completely white, free of any color at all. And the reason why I'm doing this is because just like when I'm working with regular watercolor paint, I want my areas of lightest lights or highlights left without any color in them, because the whiteness of the paper is going to stand for my highlights. If I cover up those lightest areas, then I'm going to disappear those lightest values, and I'm going to have to add them in at the end with maybe some other medium. And in this particular case, I don't want to bring in another medium at the end. I want to do everything with my watercolor pencils. The way I approach using watercolor pencils is in many ways similar to how I use regular watercolor paint, meaning I make sure to save my whites, number one. Number two, I approach everything incrementally in layers, allowing each layer to dry in between. And another thing that is very similar is I start by placing my color in the areas of darkest values that I'm gonna be developing, because this way, once I go in with my paintbrush and my bit of water, I can bring out that pigment, bring out that color outwards and dissipate it into the lighter areas. This creates a soft, natural looking gradient, and at the same time, I'm keeping those areas of highlights protected and not flattening anything out with too much color. So after having placed my initial layer of color with my watercolor pencils, I am going in with a slightly dampened size 4 round brush to move that color around and start creating a bit of a painterly effect. As you can see, as I am doing these very gentle scribbling motions with the tip of my paintbrush, I am moving the color out from that darker, more saturated area, and very naturally that color is starting to dissipate and turn more and more transparent as I move it into the lighter areas. And still, I'm making sure not to place or not to extend that color into my lightest values. Be very, very gentle as you're doing these little scribbling or scrubbing motions on your watercolor paper. You never want to damage it. I am using the very tip of my paintbrush very, very lightly, and if there is any chance that your paper is starting to get damaged, stop, take a step back, and allow everything to dry completely. Because even though we're using paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums, you need to remember that wet paper is fragile paper, and oftentimes we need to take a step back and allow the paper to dry to regain its strength, and then we can go back in. Now, if you're curious as to how I know where I'm going to be developing my darkest values, I am constantly looking at a reference photo. And this is something that I always recommend to anyone just getting started. It's incredibly important that we develop our observational skills and our ability to pinpoint highlights, midtones, and darks so that we're then able to recreate them effectively. We need to develop our observational skills by using reference photos or seeing what things actually look like in real life via direct observation. This is especially important for artists who are looking to develop any level of realism in their work. It's important to understand how light works, and it's important to learn about the actual three-dimensional structure of whatever it is that you're trying to draw or paint, because it's those planes and the light situation in that given room that in combination create the different values that we see. Now, having said all this, it's not necessary to be a slave to your reference, especially if you already have a good understanding of light behavior and you already kind of know the structure of, the subject that you're drawing or painting. You can change things up. You can bring things in, you can take things out, you can modify colors. Like for example, in this case, I made that bottom macaron blue instead of a very, very light, almost off-white color. And I am also making the top macaron lighter than the chocolatey brown that I am able to see in my reference. However, even though I'm changing the color, I am paying attention to where those lights and midtones and darkest darks are within each macaron. Okay, so once I was done with the initial layer of color all throughout my 3 macarons, I am now going into the first one, once again, the one on the top, and starting to develop my second layer of color. At this point, I am still using exactly the same color that I was before for that first layer, and I am also making sure to place the second layer of color with my watercolor pencils in the areas of darkest values that I'm gonna be developing. I always start with placing that color in the darkest darks. Now, at this point, I am pressing down a little bit harder on my paper with my watercolor pencils. I don't want to burnish it. I don't want to begin scratching it or anything like that, but I do want the second layer to appear a little bit darker, a little bit more saturated. Be careful though, because if you end up placing way too much color on your paper, you're gonna end up completely disappearing, completely overtaking or covering up your first layers of lighter colors and even your highlights, and you don't want to do that. So I would recommend working little by little, work incrementally, and make sure that you're creating a wide variety of different values. Because remember that it's ultimately a wide range of values that are gonna give something a sense of three-dimensional form. And if you start covering up those values, then you're gonna start flattening areas out. And this is perfectly fine if you're going for more of a flat illustration look, because that's also very beautiful and can be very visually appealing. But in this case, we are going for a certain level of realism. Not hyper-realism in any sense. This is still more of a stylized illustration, but we do want to add in a little bit of that three-dimensional look, and so values are important. By this point in the process, as you can see, I already have areas of highlights, completely white paper shining through. I have very light lights and I have darker midtones. As you can see, after having placed that second layer of color, I went back in with my size 4 round brush. It's just damp, it's not wet. You have to make sure that you're not bringing out way too much water onto your watercolor paper, because that can certainly cause problems. And I continue doing my gentle scribbling motions. And as you can see, this darker, more saturated version of this color is now gradiating into the previous lighter layer. All right, so we're moving on to the third layer of color here, and I'm moving back up to the macaron on the top. And it is time to switch on over to our dark brown color. Now, guess what I do? I start by placing this color in the darkest areas that I'm gonna be developing once again. As you're laying down this color and any of the previous colors really, we wanna make sure that we're staying away from any outlines or stark looking shapes or marks, because that's gonna detract from the realism of your piece. In realism, there are no outlines, and as I am doing these very gentle scribbling motions, applying my color on my paper, I am thinking more of abstract little shapes created by shadows and by lights. I'm continuing to place this dark brown color in the areas that I'm going to be developing darker values in all throughout the 3 macarons. I am constantly looking at my reference photo for clues as to what areas I need to darken, and I make sure to bring in my knowledge of light behavior to ensure that I am adding in areas of cast shadow in between the macarons and rounding out their structure a little bit more by placing this darker value wherever I see fit. And I also want to make sure that the filling of each macaron looks darker than the exterior cookies. So I make sure to add in some of this brown in these areas as well. And after I feel I've placed enough of this dark brown color to darken those darkest darks, which by the way, always remember that it's way easier to go back in and darken than to go back and lighten something. So take it a step at a time and only place a bit of this brown wherever you need it. I am then going to go back to the top macaron to do some overlapping using the same color that I was using in the beginning for each macaron. So the base color that I am using for each macaron is what I am using right on top of that dark brown. At this point in the process, I like taking a step back from my work, and if I feel that I have very large, very light areas that perhaps aren't that light or maybe a lighter mid-tone, I go in with a very light layer of that base color so that I can then go back in with a dampened paintbrush and darken that value just a bit. We want to make sure that we have a good amount of mid-tones developed and not only very dark darks and very light lights. So as you can see, I've laid down that dark brown. I've then overlapped the base color for each macaron, extending that base color in areas where I needed to perhaps develop a bit of a darker value. And then I am going back in with a damp paintbrush and doing very gentle scribbling motions or side to side motions to blend these colors together and get a nice painterly effect. If you accidentally lay down way too much water on your watercolor paper, I would go right in and absorb that excess water with my absorbent towel. And then I would just take a step back and allow that area to dry completely before going back in. Or if you are going to go back in immediately, just make sure that you're doing so very, very carefully so that you don't start overworking your paper because of the amount of water that is already there. Notice how those areas of lightest highlights are getting smaller and smaller as I continue moving this last layer of color around, and I have continued working on those midtones, those transition kind of values between the lightest lights and the darkest darks. All right, so depending on how your work is looking at this point, you may decide to just leave it the way it is, and that would be perfectly fine. I decide to go back in with another very light layer of my initial base color for each macaron, but I'm going into only little tiny areas of midtones that I want to darken. And I'm also starting to think about little kind of texture marks that I want to add here and there. You're going to notice that in this layer, I actually leave some of the marks created by the watercolor pencil just completely free of any water at all. I don't even go over them because at this point in the process, once I'm starting to finish up, I like to use my watercolor pencils to add in a little bit of texture wherever I see fit. And at the very end of this process, I'm actually going to be using my watercolor pencils to add in a little bit more texture, and I'm not going to be touching them with water or my paintbrush at all. Before moving on with the rest of this watercolor painting process, I want to take a quick moment to share about all of the amazing and super helpful content that I am constantly publishing over at my Patreon site on a regular basis that is available for you at a very, very low monthly cost. This is my membership site, which I created about a year ago, in which I am constantly sharing new exclusive content in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated drawing and watercolor painting tutorials, each complete with its own downloadable outline sketch, its supply list with specific colors, and high-resolution reference images. There are already 39 Patreon-exclusive tutorials uploaded onto the library that you can enjoy immediately upon joining that I haven't shared anywhere else, and 2 new tutorials get shared every month. I also share a new weekly sketchbook prompt every single Monday that is specifically designed to keep you consistent and progressing your artistic skills and knowledge. I have a library of classes on art fundamentals covering all of the basics that I learned about in art school, as well as in courses and resources that I've invested in myself. There are already 18 classes on art fundamentals that are designed to be seen in a sequential order in that library, and a new one gets added in every single month. I also do a private live Q&A/chat session every single month where you can ask me anything you like and we get to interact directly. Members in the $6 tier and upwards get access to feedback from me whenever they need it via email, and much more. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to my Patreon membership website down below in the description box in case you'd like to go and check out all of the tiers that are available. All right, let's get back to the tutorial. So right about here, I'm gonna go in with my damp paintbrush one last time, all throughout my macarons, making sure that I am cleaning out my paintbrush bristles between each cookie. And after that, all that's left is adding in the area of gray cast shadow right below this little stack of macarons, and doing that final little layer with the watercolor pencils, in which I'm just gonna be adding that texture. For my cast shadow, I want to make sure that the area that is darkest is closest to my macarons, because this is the area of occlusion shadow. So this is where I place most of my color in. And once I have enough ivory black added in, I then use a size 14 round brush with a larger amount of water in it than I had been using before to smooth that color out and gradiate it outwards. And once I'm done with that, I allow everything to dry completely. And then, as I was mentioning before, I go back in to carve out some darkest darks and add in a little bit of texture using the base color of each macaron. And finally, if you'd like, and if you have any of those pencil lines showing, you can go in with a soft graphite eraser and very gently erase those pencil marks. Alright everyone, that is it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, please make sure to give it a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I'm doing here on YouTube and allows more people to get to know about my channel. If you have any questions or comments for me, make sure to leave them down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from you and I always read every single one of your comments. Thank you so very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe because I share new videos every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and stay inspired. Bye guys!